A woman was humiliated in court while defending the truth. But when she spoke again, everyone froze. Nadine's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter. It was stamped with the official seal of the county courthouse and bore her full name in bold print. As she read the contents, her heart sank. She had been summoned to testify in a corporate misconduct trial, not as a plaintiff or a defendant, but as a witness. The name at the top of the case made her stomach churn: Andrew Kellerman, her former boss. The same man who had publicly humiliated her 5 years ago in front of an entire department, just before firing her without cause. Nadine hadn't heard that name since, and the wounds hadn't fully closed. She thought that chapter of her life was long behind her. Apparently, it wasn't. It wasn't just any case. It was a class action lawsuit involving multiple employees who had come forward to accuse the company's executive team of harassment, manipulation, and financial fraud. Nadine had not been one of those who filed the complaint. She had tried once, years ago, to raise red flags internally, only to be silenced, discarded, and branded a disgruntled ex-employee. But now, someone had listed her as a key witness. Her presence, apparently, could be vital. The letter said she had the option to decline, but Nadine knew better. This wasn't a request. It was a reminder that sometimes, the past doesn't let you go until you face it head-on. The night before the hearing, Nadine sat by her small kitchen table, the same one she had kept since she left her former life behind. She stared at a folder she had kept hidden all these years. Inside were old emails, HR memos, copies of reports she once compiled, and a printed copy of the incident report she had submitted, only for it to be conveniently lost by the company. She never showed these to anyone, partly because she feared retaliation, but mostly because no one had ever asked. Now, a subpoena had changed everything. As she flipped through the documents, painful memories came flooding back. The days when she stayed late, took on double workloads, and tried to stand up against toxic behaviors, only to be cornered, mocked, and eventually removed from her position under the guise of restructuring. Her last day was etched into her mind like a scar. Andrew Kellerman had stood at the front of the room during a team meeting, looked directly at her, and said, "Some people just aren't cut out for leadership." The room had fallen awkwardly silent as he continued with the presentation, completely ignoring the tears welling in her eyes. Nadine had walked out that day carrying nothing but a cardboard box and an overwhelming sense of failure. She had never set foot in a corporate office since. Instead, she picked up freelance data analysis jobs from home, surviving in quiet obscurity. But now, all those buried feelings were surfacing again, and the courtroom was calling her to relive it all. The courthouse looked the same as it did when she last visited it for jury duty a decade ago. But this time, it wasn't about civic duty, it was personal. As Nadine entered the building, the sterile scent of floor polish and the quiet buzz of voices made her skin crawl. She felt out of place in her modest navy suit, especially when she caught sight of Andrew Kellerman arriving in a sharp, tailored gray ensemble, flanked by a group of attorneys who looked more like a public relations team than legal counsel. One of them, tall, smug, and clearly seasoned, locked eyes with her for a moment. His expression was unreadable but cold. The tension inside the courtroom was immediate. Former employees filled the benches, and reporters lined the back with notepads and microphones ready. Nadine spotted some familiar faces, people she had once passed by in the break room or worked with on tight deadlines. Most of them looked uncomfortable, casting quick glances in her direction before looking away. As she took her seat near the front, she felt the familiar heat of shame creep into her cheeks, even though she had done nothing wrong. That was the thing about humiliation, it lingered, long after the moment had passed. The only thing louder than the whispers in the room was the pounding of her own heart. Before the proceedings began, one of the attorneys from Kellerman's team strolled over to her row. He leaned in casually and whispered, "Ms. Wyatt, we appreciate your attendance. But just a heads up, it's best to stay within your lane when asked questions." The message was clear: don't say too much. Nadine didn't respond. She stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, silently wondering if she should walk out right then and there. But something inside her shifted. It wasn't fear this time, it was defiance. Still, she couldn't ignore how every step of this process felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. When the judge entered and the session began, the air grew tense. Nadine's name was mentioned within the first 30 minutes. She was asked to approach the witness stand during the early phase of the trial, much sooner than she had expected. As she stood and made her way up, all eyes turned to her, including Kellerman's. He didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge her. As if she was just a line in a spreadsheet that had been deleted long ago. That disregard, that quiet dismissal, was more cutting than any insult. And yet, she stood tall, holding her breath as she raised her right hand to take the oath. The initial questioning was routine. Her name, her previous position, her role at the company, and her tenure. Then came the more loaded questions. Had she ever witnessed inappropriate behavior? Had she ever reported anything? Her voice, at first, came out thinner than she expected. She spoke slowly, carefully. When asked if she had documentation, she hesitated. The lead defense attorney, Franklin Reed, seized the moment. "So you're saying, Ms. Wyatt, that you made serious claims and have no evidence to support them?" His tone was dripping with sarcasm, his smile smug. Some people in the courtroom chuckled quietly, and Nadine's cheeks burned. She wanted to shout that she had the evidence. She wanted to explain everything, but panic clamped her throat. She remembered how easily her words were twisted in the past, how quickly they were used against her. Instead, she simply said, "I wasn't allowed to keep those files at the time. I was told to erase them." The laughter died down slightly, but the damage was done. To the room, she looked like a bitter ex-employee, fumbling to be heard. She stepped down, hands shaking, and returned to her seat without a single person meeting her gaze. It felt like history repeating itself, humiliated again, but this time in a courtroom full of strangers. During a break, Nadine stepped outside into the narrow courtyard adjacent to the courthouse. She needed air, but the moment her heels clicked against the stone walkway, she felt someone following her. Turning around, she saw Franklin Reed again, this time without the courtroom decorum. "You know," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "your little emotional act might work for the press, but in here, facts matter." Nadine didn't respond. She could tell he was trying to provoke her, to shake her before the trial resumed. His smirk deepened when she remained silent. "Walk away, Ms. Wyatt. Do yourself a favor." Back inside, the judge called for the next phase of testimonies. Nadine wasn't on the list again, but that didn't stop the defense from referencing her earlier answers repeatedly, mocking her lack of documentation and portraying her as unreliable. With every mention of her name, her stomach tightened. When a juror glanced in her direction during one particularly cutting remark, she felt her composure slipping. Each comment chipped away at her confidence. She could see Andrew Kellerman watching from his seat, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He hadn't said a word since she arrived, but his silence spoke volumes. It was the same weapon he used to use at staff meetings. The second day in court brought little relief. Nadine arrived early, hoping to blend into the crowd, but the courtroom was smaller that day, more intimate. When Franklin requested that she be brought back for cross-examination, she felt the ground shift beneath her. "Just a few clarifications," he said, his voice polite but laced with sharp intent. He pulled up a copy of her resignation letter, printed and enlarged for the court. "You wrote here, and I quote, 'due to ongoing stress and health concerns.' No mention of misconduct. Why now, Ms. Wyatt?" The courtroom waited, breath held. Nadine's throat tightened. "At the time, I was advised to leave quietly or face legal action for defamation. I was scared." Her voice cracked slightly. Franklin leaned in. "So, just to be clear, you didn't speak up until now because it was inconvenient?" There were a few uncomfortable chuckles from the gallery. Nadine felt her face flush. "Because I wasn't safe to." But the damage was done again. Franklin gave a knowing glance to the jury and stepped away. Nadine returned to her seat with her heart pounding so loudly it nearly drowned out the proceedings. During lunch break, Nadine found herself alone in a hallway usually reserved for staff. She had stepped away to gather herself but stumbled upon a partially open office door. Inside, muffled voices argued, recognizable ones. "She's not credible." "Get her off the record," said one man. "We can't. She was subpoenaed." "Then discredit her further. She's already cracking." Nadine froze. She recognized one of the voices as belonging to a junior partner on the defense team. Her body stiffened. They weren't interested in truth, just winning. Just silencing. Just surviving the scandal. She quickly stepped back, her heart thudding against her ribs. If there was any doubt that this case was being twisted, it was gone now. But how could she bring it up? She had no proof of what she heard, and accusing someone without evidence would only weaken her position further. The legal system, she realized bitterly, didn't always care for justice, it cared for structure, for hierarchy, for show. And right now, she was the perfect scapegoat for doubt. By the time she returned to the courtroom, she had made a quiet decision. She couldn't afford to stay quiet much longer. As the day's hearing ended, Nadine lingered in the corridor. Her mind was racing, debating whether she should walk away from the case entirely. Just then, an older man sitting on a bench near the exit spoke softly. "You used to work for Kellerman Holdings, didn't you?" She hesitated before answering. "Yes." The man nodded, his voice low but firm. "You spoke the truth today, even if they didn't want to hear it. Don't let them push you back into silence." Nadine blinked, surprised. "Do I know you?" The man shook his head. "No. But I know what that kind of silence does to a person." Nadine felt something shift in her. It wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, a quiet resurgence of the strength she had nearly forgotten she had. "Who are you?" she asked. The man didn't answer directly. "Let's just say I've been on the other side of a courtroom long enough to know when someone is lying, and when someone's just been too afraid to speak." Before she could ask more, he stood, nodded respectfully, and walked away. She watched him disappear into the shadows of the corridor. Something about him lingered with her, like a whisper from the future reminding her the battle wasn't over yet. That night, Nadine returned home and opened the storage box she hadn't touched in years. Tucked between old tax forms and rental agreements was a faded USB drive, one she had forgotten she kept. Her hands trembled as she plugged it into her laptop. Inside were several folders from her old work laptop, including one titled HR/_complaints/_backup. She clicked it open. Dozens of documents loaded, scanned forms, internal memos, and one that made her stop breathing, a copy of the original misconduct report she had filed, complete with timestamps and witness annotations. For a moment, she stared in disbelief. She remembered being forced to delete everything, watched over by someone from the IT department. But she must have made a backup earlier. It had been an act of desperation, done during a moment of panic and instinct, and then buried in shame and fear. Nadine leaned back in her chair, clutching the drive. Her humiliation wasn't without record. Her pain wasn't baseless. She finally had something solid, something they didn't know she had. And now, everything had changed. As Nadine stared at the glowing screen, memories that she had locked away years ago began to resurface with striking clarity. She remembered the day she filed the report, the way her hands had trembled as she typed each incident, recounting inappropriate comments from Kellerman, meetings held behind closed doors, and deadlines that came with threats disguised as company expectations. She had gone to HR, believing the system would protect her. Instead, she was told it was not the right time to make waves. Hours later, she was pulled into a meeting with two managers and asked to consider her future with the company. She had left that meeting in tears, walking past the same coworkers who once praised her work. No one said a word. A week later, she was officially let go due to department restructuring. That was the phrase they used: clinical, detached, and devoid of the truth. But it wasn't just about losing a job. It was the humiliation of being erased, of having years of work and dedication reduced to a line in a termination letter. Now, with the files in her possession, the emotional weight began to lift slightly. Nadine felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, restrained sense of purpose. The following morning, Nadine returned to court with the USB in her purse. She hadn't yet shared its contents with anyone. She needed time to understand what she had, but just knowing it was there gave her strength. During a new witness testimony, a former intern described a toxic environment, and while his account was dismissed by the defense as inexperienced misinterpretation, Nadine noticed how closely it mirrored her own experience. The patterns were the same: gaslighting, belittlement, manufactured pressure. It wasn't coincidence. It was a culture crafted to break people quietly. Later, she stepped outside and sat on the stone ledge beneath a sycamore tree. She replayed Franklin's voice in her mind: stay in your lane. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a strategy. The goal was never to win with truth. It was to discredit, discourage, and outlast the whistleblowers. They counted on fear. That's when Nadine realized her mistake years ago hadn't been speaking up, it was doing it alone. This time, she wouldn't be isolated. She had the file. She had the story. And now, she had the will to see it through. The shift in the courtroom dynamic was subtle, but Nadine noticed it. The judge, previously passive, began to interrupt the defense's objections more often. He requested clearer explanations and asked for sources when the corporate lawyers made sweeping claims. Nadine suspected he had seen enough to start questioning the narrative. During the break, she watched as the judge quietly spoke with the court clerk, and then disappeared into chambers for longer than usual. Something had changed. The weight of the testimonies, and the inconsistencies, was beginning to register. After recess, the judge announced that all further witnesses would be reviewed with additional scrutiny. Franklin looked visibly irritated. Nadine, however, felt a small ember of hope. If she presented the file now, at the right moment, it might not be dismissed. But she knew better than to act impulsively. Timing was everything in court. Evidence wasn't just about what you had, it was about when you showed it, and to whom. She would wait, watch, and prepare. Her moment would come, and when it did, she would make sure they couldn't ignore her again. By the fourth day, the courtroom had a different energy. More people had shown up, journalists, former employees, even curious locals who had read headlines about the growing case. One woman, seated in the back, quietly mouthed thank you when Nadine walked past. She didn't recognize her, but the meaning was clear. The silence that once smothered her was slowly cracking. People were paying attention. The gallery whispered less when she was called. Franklin's jabs no longer got the same smirks they did before. Even Andrew Kellerman looked changed. He no longer appeared smug, but distracted, his jaw tense, his eyes wandering toward his phone during testimonies. When Nadine was referenced again in cross, her prior lack of evidence was brought up once more. But this time, the reaction was different. There were murmurs of dissent in the gallery, and the judge narrowed his eyes. "Let's not make assumptions about what the witness does or does not possess," he said pointedly. Nadine didn't smile, but she sat taller in her seat. The tide was slowly turning. At the end of the day's proceedings, Nadine was approached by one of the assistant district attorneys, Alana Grant, a sharp and observant woman who had been quiet throughout most of the trial. "Ms. Wyatt," she said, pulling her aside, "I believe you were holding back the other day." Nadine hesitated, unsure if it was a trap. "I was overwhelmed," she replied. Alana nodded knowingly. "And yet, you kept your composure. I'd like to give you another chance to speak. But this time, we're going to do it right. You'll have protection. Support. And if you have any documents, now is the time." Nadine considered it for a long moment. Then she pulled the USB from her purse and handed it over. "I don't know everything that's on here, but it's from the week I left. I think it matters." Alana took it carefully, glancing at it as though it might explode in her hand. "I'll review it tonight. We'll schedule you to return to the stand." Nadine didn't sleep that night. But for the first time in a long time, her restlessness came not from fear, but anticipation. Something was about to shift in her favor. The courtroom was packed when Nadine was called to the stand for the second time. The judge addressed her directly. "Ms. Wyatt, I've reviewed your previous testimony. You've been given another opportunity to clarify your statement. Do you wish to proceed?" Nadine took a breath and nodded. Her voice no longer trembled as she began. "There were things I couldn't say before. I was afraid. But I have evidence now. Documents I backed up before being forced to delete everything." She reached for the folder Alana had prepared, filled with printed files from the USB. As she flipped through each page, pointing out timestamps, author names, and HR memos marked confidential, the courtroom shifted. People leaned forward. Some scribbled notes. Franklin tried to object multiple times, but the judge silenced him. Nadine didn't flinch. She spoke with calm precision, referring to emails from executives discussing controlling narratives and dismissing problematic staff without HR intervention. Her final words echoed in the courtroom, "I wasn't fired for poor performance. I was silenced for trying to protect others." For the first time, she saw Kellerman's eyes drop. Following Nadine's testimony, the prosecution introduced a new piece of evidence, an internal email recovered from the drive that hadn't previously been disclosed. It was between Kellerman and the head of HR, dated 3 days before Nadine's dismissal. The subject line read, "Wyatt's escalation." In it, Kellerman wrote, "She's too loud. Handle it quietly. You know what to do." Gasps filled the courtroom. Even the jury reacted visibly, some whispering to each other as the judge called for silence. Franklin looked rattled. "Objection, Your Honor, we don't know the full context," the judge cut him off. "I think the context is becoming clear." Nadine watched from the stand, her heart pounding but steady. The email was her smoking gun. Years of self-doubt unraveled with every word the prosecutor read aloud. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was proof of a deliberate pattern. And suddenly, everything she had endured felt like it had a purpose. During the recess that followed, Nadine stepped into the hallway for air. She wasn't alone for long. A woman in her mid-40s approached hesitantly, clutching a visitor badge. "I worked under Kellerman, too," she said softly. 12 years ago. I saw what happened to you back then, and I saw what happened to others before you. I kept quiet. I couldn't afford to lose my job." Nadine nodded slowly, understanding more than the woman realized. "I want to say something," the woman added, her voice stronger now. "Not in court, but to the press. People need to know this isn't just one case, it's a culture." Nadine touched her arm gently. "Then do it. You don't need a courtroom to tell the truth." As the woman turned to leave, Nadine felt something powerful rising around her, a quiet movement, awakened by her refusal to shrink back. She wasn't just giving testimony anymore. She was making space for others to speak. The rest of the week unraveled quickly. 3 more former employees came forward, one submitted an affidavit, another requested to testify anonymously, and the third released a statement through a reporter. All of them described eerily similar experiences of suppression, retaliation, and forced resignations. The media, now seated in every corner of the gallery, had shifted from neutral observers to vigilant recorders of scandal. Headlines began appearing before each recess was over. "Pattern of abuse emerges at Kellerman Holdings." The defense team scrambled to maintain control, but their coordinated responses now sounded hollow. Franklin, once so composed, fumbled through objections and interrupted witnesses with a desperation that didn't go unnoticed. Nadine watched it unfold not with glee, but with a quiet, surreal awareness. For years, she had been dismissed as a disgruntled voice. Now, she was becoming the echo that exposed the system behind the silence. And she wasn't alone anymore. By the next morning, the courthouse was surrounded by news vans. Reporters called out to anyone leaving the building, eager for statements. Nadine kept her head down, but she could feel the cameras turning toward her. "Ms. Wyatt, do you believe Kellerman will be held accountable?" someone shouted. She didn't answer. Not yet. Inside, a new energy pulsed through the room. The judge had granted permission for extended testimonies based on newly submitted evidence. It was no longer just a trial, it was an unraveling. Nadine was asked to clarify parts of the recovered report, now entered into evidence. She did so clearly, pointing out changes made after she submitted it, sections edited, sentences removed, and footnotes erased. "This version was never meant to be seen by HR," she said. "The one I submitted included names. Details. They were scrubbed." The prosecution presented both versions side by side. The jury took note. And for the first time, Kellerman looked genuinely concerned. Not because of the legal battle, but because he could no longer control the story. That afternoon, while Nadine sat quietly in the witness room, her phone buzzed with a message from a former coworker. "It's everywhere. Confused, she clicked the attached link. A major news outlet had published excerpts from her HR report, the original, unedited version, leaked anonymously. The headline read, "Whistleblower Files Reveal Corporate Pattern of Abuse." The report had gone viral within hours. Dozens of former employees were tagging the article, sharing their stories in the comments. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others thanked Nadine for being the first to do what they couldn't. The prosecution was furious about the leak, worried it could compromise the proceedings, but Nadine knew it was inevitable. Once the truth was out, it couldn't be contained. And with every person who came forward online, the weight she carried lessened. At court, Franklin demanded a mistrial, claiming the media coverage was poisoning the jury. But the judge disagreed, stating the evidence had been entered legally, and no one had confirmed the source of the leak. It was a moment of balance shifting again, this time irreversibly. 2 days later, the unexpected happened. The CEO of Kellerman Holdings, who had remained silent since the trial began, issued a public statement. In it, he claimed ignorance of the hostile culture and distanced himself from Andrew Kellerman, calling the events deeply troubling and not representative of company values. But the statement fell flat. Too polished, too rehearsed. The public, now invested, saw it for what it was, damage control. Still, it rattled the courtroom when his legal team arrived with a proposed settlement. Nadine was called into a private meeting with the prosecution. "They're offering full financial compensation and a formal apology," Alana explained. "They want to avoid a deeper investigation into internal operations." Nadine sat still. But what about accountability? What about Kellerman? Alana paused. "He's being pushed out quietly. No charges unless we move forward." Nadine looked down at the offer letter, untouched on the table. Money wouldn't erase the shame. A settlement would silence the story. And she wasn't ready to be quiet again. The next morning, Nadine entered the courtroom and addressed the judge herself. "Your Honor," she said, steady and composed, "I've been offered a settlement." "I decline." Gasps echoed across the room. Franklin muttered under his breath. The judge looked at her carefully, then nodded. "Ms. Wyatt, you understand the implications of rejecting a legal resolution?" She did. But silence had cost her more than any paycheck could replace. She wasn't doing this for revenge anymore. She was doing it for every voice that had been stifled like hers. Kellerman glanced at her then, just briefly. For the first time, there was no condescension in his eyes. There was recognition. Maybe even fear. Nadine didn't flinch. She knew now that power didn't lie in titles or polished statements. It lay in truth. In persistence. And in refusing to be buried by shame. The trial would go on. She would see it through. And if that meant taking the long road to justice, so be it. It didn't take long for cracks to form in Kellerman's defense. One of the company's junior executives, subpoenaed last minute, admitted under oath that she had been asked to clean up files from Nadine's folder on the shared drive. She confirmed the deletion of emails, including internal discussions regarding employee compliance. The courtroom fell silent. The jury was riveted. When shown a backup copy retrieved from the USB, the executive bowed her head. "That's the version I saw before I was told to edit it." Franklin's face was pale. Kellerman leaned forward, hands clasped, visibly shaken. The judge called for a recess. Outside, reporters scrambled to summarize what had just happened. A woman seated near Nadine leaned over and whispered, you've already won." Nadine didn't respond. She was still absorbing the magnitude of what had just been confirmed. The system that once dismissed her as irrelevant was now collapsing under the weight of its own lies. When court resumed, the judge addressed the room with a tone of finality. "It's clear that this case extends far beyond an isolated incident," he said. "We are now dealing with evidence of systemic misconduct, intentional suppression of complaints, and obstruction." Franklin tried one last objection, but it was over. The judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, authorizing further investigation into Kellerman Holdings' internal policies and recommending a criminal inquiry into Andrew Kellerman's actions. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in murmurs of relief. Nadine sat still, a lump forming in her throat. She wasn't crying. Not exactly. But she felt every emotion colliding: grief, vindication, fatigue, and something else she hadn't felt in years: peace. As she walked out of the courthouse, past the cameras and questions, she wasn't a headline. She was someone who had spoken when it mattered most. And finally, she had been heard. The courthouse was quieter now. The rush of reporters had faded, and only a few lingered, hoping for final comments. Nadine remained inside a while longer, seated on the now empty witness bench, running her fingers along the smooth wood. The courtroom felt different, less intimidating, more human. It wasn't the setting that had changed, but her place in it. Weeks ago, she had walked in as a ghost from the past, unsure if her voice would even matter. Now, she had shifted the entire course of the trial with nothing but the truth and the courage to stand in it. As she left the building, a man in a gray coat stood waiting by the marble steps. It was the older gentleman from before, the one who'd spoken to her early in the trial. He stepped forward and smiled gently. "You did exactly what you needed to," he said. Nadine paused. "Who are you really?" He reached into his pocket and handed her a card. It read, "Thomas F. Keene, retired Superior Court Judge." Nadine blinked, stunned. "My daughter worked under Kellerman," he added. "She never got her chance. You gave her one." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Nadine holding something far heavier than paper: gratitude that reached across silence and time. A week later, Nadine returned home to a stack of unopened mail. Most of it was standard: bills, flyers, court correspondence. But among the pile, she found a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded letter, written in careful cursive. It was from a woman named Elise, who had worked at the company years before Nadine ever joined. "I watched the coverage," it began. "What you did gave me closure. I carried the same shame for years. Seeing you stand there, it healed something in me." The letter went on to describe her own experiences, nearly identical in tone and pattern. She had been silenced and pushed out without explanation. "Thank you for being brave," it ended. Nadine folded the letter slowly and placed it in a box with the court files and USB. That box had once held the weight of her trauma. Now, it held the records of her strength. She didn't need recognition or applause. But knowing she'd helped someone else breathe a little easier, that mattered more than any verdict. The city moved on quickly, as it always did. Headlines shifted to other stories, and Kellerman Holdings replaced leadership, launched a PR campaign, and promised reform. But Nadine didn't watch any of it unfold. She chose peace instead. One quiet morning, she returned to the coffee shop she used to visit after long workdays, before everything fell apart. The barista, unaware of who she was, asked for her name to write on the cup. "Nadine," she said softly, and when she heard it spoken back, it felt whole again. She took her drink to the corner table by the window and opened her laptop. She had been offered a role by the city's new Workplace Ethics Committee, a consulting position to help build safer, more transparent work environments. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Impactful. As she typed her response to accept the offer, she thought of all the people still carrying quiet pain, still unsure if their truth would ever matter. She didn't know all their names. But she would work for them anyway. A month later, Nadine was invited to speak at a university seminar on ethics and leadership. She wasn't the keynote, just one voice among many. But as she stood in front of the small auditorium, sharing a part of her journey, she noticed the students weren't checking their phones or whispering among themselves. They were listening. Not to a hero. Not to a headline. Just to a woman who had once been silenced, and who now spoke without fear. Afterward, a young woman approached her quietly. "I've been dealing with something at work. I didn't think anyone would believe me." Nadine didn't give advice. She didn't hand out slogans or rehearse lines. She simply nodded and said, "Sometimes, telling the truth is the hardest thing you'll do. But it's also the most important." The woman thanked her with tears in her eyes. Nadine left the building slowly, letting the silence wrap around her like a warm coat. She didn't need the crowd anymore. She had herself. On a rainy Saturday morning, Nadine visited the park near her childhood home. The same one where she used to sit on the swings as a teenager, dreaming of a life where she mattered. She walked slowly, watching kids run through puddles and parents chase after them. Life, messy and joyful, moved on. She found an empty bench beneath a sycamore tree, pulled her scarf tight, and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt no fear about what tomorrow might bring. The win hadn't been the verdict, or the headlines, or even the apologies that came after. The real victory was in knowing she had stayed standing when everything pushed her to fall. That she had turned humiliation into truth, and silence into change. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. She was no longer the woman walked out of an office with nothing. She was the woman who walked back in and rewrote the ending. And now, she sat quietly beneath a gray sky, knowing, deep in her bones, that she was finally free.